Okay, so we're all done now with epithelial tissues, and it's time to start talking about connective tissues, the second kind of tissue found in the human body. And so in this video we'll be introducing the connective tissues, and we'll talk about the components of them, especially thinking about the cells that we find in the connective tissues and then the fibers that those cells produce. So here we go. So connective tissues are by far the most abundant of the body tissues by weight, and they're very diverse as well. So there's a whole lot of them, and there's a lot of different kinds of connective tissues. So we can think of connective tissues as tendons and ligaments, but bone is also a connective tissue, and so is cartilage, and so is fat, and even blood is considered a connective tissue. So part of the job of this section is to really try to see what is it that kind of binds all of these together. How can tendons and ligaments and fat and blood all be connective tissue? And I've got some pictures here for you to look at. I hope you're not grossed out too much by the foot. So this is a completely dissected foot, or a well dissected foot, and we're looking at some of the connective tissues here. So this is what a tendon looks like, and here's another tendon. Probably shouldn't draw right over them because then you can't see more tendon here. And hopefully you recognize this tendon here at the back of the heel. And then here is an electron micrograph looking at some of the red blood cells, the erythrocytes that we see in blood, and these guys, the white blood cells as well. So connective tissues, they form the framework on which epithelial tissues are found, and within which the muscle and nervous tissues are embedded. So connective tissues are just all over the body. So what are some of the functions of connective tissues? Well, there is directly that connecting function, so binding two different structures or more structures together, and areolar tissue and the dense regular connective tissues, those are the tendons and ligaments, are one example of this, are some examples of the binding together, and support and protection, certainly. So cartilage and bone each have a very supportive and protective function. Here we see some spongy bone at the tip, or at the epiphysis of a bone, as well as the cartilage that lines or covers that bone, and found inside the joint capsule. These tendons here clearly are connecting the muscle. So here's the biceps brachii here, and they're connected by the tendons to the bones of the scapula, and also by tendons to the bones of the forearm. And then transporting material is a third function that we see associated with connective tissues. And so blood and lymph, and again, red blood cell, white blood cell here, and a macrophage, a third kind, I'm sorry, not a macrophage, a platelet, a third kind of element that we find in blood. Some more functions: energy storage and insulation in the body. That's what we associate with adipose tissue. And so here we have someone taking a measurement of how much body fat is stored underneath the skin at the waist. This is a slice through adipose tissue, and so all this empty space that we see inside the cell is not really empty. It's actually filled with a fat droplet, and the nucleus is squeezed off to the edge of the cell, so there's no room for anything else but a fat droplet really inside the cell. Here's some adipose tissue dissected from a cadaver. And defense of the body is also a function, and so the white blood cell is the big defender of the body. And then there's even more functions, but I think we've talked enough about that, and we can move on forward. So now we want to think about some of the characteristics of connective tissues. So first one characteristic we want to talk about is blood supply to connective tissues, because there's a variety of amounts of blood supply. Some connective tissues are very richly vascularized. Adipose tissue is one of those, because we got to bring the nutrients or those fats to the adipose tissue cells. Bones are another one that is very richly vascularized. And so here's a slice of the bone showing how the blood vessels branch and branch repeatedly within bone to bring nutrients up close to those bone cells. Some connective tissues are poorly vascularized, so tendons and ligaments are an example of a connective tissue that has some blood supply, but not very much. And then there are some connective tissues that are mostly avascular. Remember, avascular, A meaning without, vascular, blood vessels. So most cartilages are either poorly vascularized or even have regions of the cartilages that are completely avascular. And so here we're looking at the meniscus in the knee, which is a cartilage. Out here is referred to the pink zone because there is some blood supply out of the lateral portions of the meniscus. But once you get into the middle portion, where as it thins down, no blood supply in there. And so that's why meniscus tears. And they usually tear here in this thinner region of the cartilage. Meniscus tears are very difficult to repair, and usually doctors will go in and just trim out the ripped cartilage. So what is it then? What's the composition of a connective tissue? And there are three components that we see associated with a connective tissue. First, there's a specialized cell that, and we'll see that different connective tissues have different specialized cells, but they're always going to be characterized by a small set of specialized cells that are associated with that connective tissue. And then there are two other components that when you put them together, we talk about as extracellular matrix. So this is just the stuff that is outside the boundaries of the cells. And it's composed of two materials. First, a fluid, and usually it's more of a gel than a thin flowing fluid, and we refer to that as the ground substance. So it's not ground like coffee grounds, like chunked up into finely stuff. I think the reason it's ground substance is because it's the basis in which everything else is found. It's sort of the medium, the dirt that everything else grows in. That's how it works for me, at least. That's how I think of it. And so that's a specialized fluid, and it's full of dissolved proteins and nutrients and other molecules that the cells will need to make their, products. The second component of the extracellular matrix are the protein fibers that are produced by the cells that live in or that are found there in the connective tissue. And these protein fibers provide strength, elasticity, and structure to the tissue. So those fibers are very important. And what we're seeing here in the picture on this slide is something called areolar tissue. So that's one of the tissues with a connecting function. And there are two primary kinds of protein fibers. These thick protein fibers here that are between the lines I'm drawing, those are referred to as collagenous fibers. I'll have that spelled for you in the next slide. And then the little thin fibers here, those are elastic fibers that help give springiness. All right, some more characteristics of connective tissues. Rigidity is another characteristic that we see. And there's a variety of rigidity or rigidnesses in connective tissues. Some are very rigid, like bone, or the stiffer cartilages, and some are much more flexible, like the loose and dense connective tissues. Adipose, areolar tissues are both loose connective tissues. Tendon and ligaments, those are dense connective tissues, but they tend to be very flexible. All right, so what are some of those? So now let's think about the cell types that are common in connective tissues. The first of the cell types are called fibroblasts. These are cells that produce the protein fibers. This term blasts, I think of that as like meaning builder. So the fibroblasts are building the fibers. And here is an electron micrograph of a fibroblast. And that's fairly stereotypical. They're kind of these long cells that kind of have little branches on them. And so here we see this fibroblast among some of the fibers that it's producing. A second kind of cell that we see in connective tissues are macrophages. And here's an example of a macrophage. Here's an electron micrograph again. And these macrophages have the capacity to engulf and bring into the cell any damaged body cells or other debris or even pathogens. And so here we have a macrophage busy attacking these small bacteria. And that's interesting. Here it is. And those bacteria are going to be brought into the cell where the macrophage can neutralize it. Macro means big. Phage, that means eater. So these are capable of eating really, lots of stuff or really big things. And then the third kind of cell type that's found in most connective tissues is called a mast cell. And here's a slice through a mast cell, and these pink little vesicles here that have also been sliced, those are vesicles filled with histamine granules, which is one of the components or one of the materials that these mast cells produce. The other material they produce is called heparin. Heparin prevents blood clotting, and histamine, it promotes all of the characteristics that we associate with inflammation. Okay, so let's talk now about those protein fibers, and this is by talking about the three types of protein fibers that are found in connective tissues. The first kind is called a collagenous fiber. Collagenous fibers. These collagenous fibers are composed of a protein called collagen, and so there are a lot of collagen found in collagenous fibers. And the collagenous fibers have this collagen held in long, straight bundles. It's a very flexible fiber, but not very elastic. Instead of being elastic, it has what we talk about as high tensile strength. That means that you can pull really, really hard on these fibers, and they will not break. So they can withstand a lot of stress. And they are sometimes referred to as white fibers because of their color, this glistening white appearance that they have. They are very abundant in the white of the eye, the sclera. So these white fibers look white. And finally, they are very abundant, especially in ligaments, tendons, and in bones. And they're also a big component of the basement membranes that underlie the epithelial tissues. So these strong, flexible fibers are what give our skin its characteristics that help to make bone strong, because we are constantly repairing these collagenous fibers. Okay, so the second kind of fiber is called an elastic fiber. Elastic fibers are fairly easy to spot. They have this characteristic wiggly shape or wavy shape, and they're composed of a special protein called elastin, and it has a lot of the ability to be stretched, and then after whatever was pulling on the tissue releases the pull, then those fibers will snap back into their previous length and shape. They're also called yellow fibers because they have a yellowish color. Now, of course, the slide that we see here, the reason they don't look yellowish here is because they've been stained with and they stain a very dark purple. And so they're found where elasticity is very important, say in the lungs where we have to stretch the tissues as we breathe in, at the vocal cords, and in blood vessels and skin. We also find elastic fibers. The last kind of fiber is referred to as a reticular fiber. Reticular fibers, like collagenous fibers, are composed of the protein collagen, but this time, rather than being arranged in thick, straight bundles like we see in collagenous fibers, the reticular fibers have the collagen arranged in a thin, delicate, highly branched network. And this is what forms the supportive structure that we see in the spleen, the liver, the kidney, and in bone marrow. And it stabilizes and supports the position of nerves and blood vessels as well. So reticular fibers are easy to recognize because they are very thin and they branch a lot, unlike the fibers that we see associated with the collagenous fibers. So there we are. 3 kinds of connective tissue fibers: collagenous fibers, and elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. And connective tissues are composed of 3 components. They're built of specialized cells. They're built of ground substance, the gel or fluid portion of the connective tissue. And they're built of these protein fibers that we just investigated. So there we are. Everything you need to know to get started on connective tissues. And I think we're done now.